So I'm going to talk a little bit about foundations before I move on to the Young Donors Project. Basically, I've picked out some slides that I hope will illuminate this whole issue of giving to the arts and philanthropy. So a little bit of a potpourri coming up here. I'm going to focus on donor engagement. We've seen quite a growth of donor-led philanthropy, particularly amongst young people. And I think that it would be very valuable to understand more about how donors get engaged, particularly in the area of arts and culture philanthropy, which is very specialised. It attracts many of our largest gifts from very committed donors, some of whom, as we've heard, then go out and do their own fundraising from their own colleagues for more gifts, bypassing the whole fundraising infrastructure completely. The arts and culture offer is often quite specialised, and it should be so. So I'm going to speak a little bit about foundations funding, and then I'll move on to the younger donors. So I've been tracking the spending of family-funded foundations in the UK for the last decade, funded by a family foundation who wanted to know more about how much wealthy families were giving back in the UK. And now, as a result, these are my reports over the last decade. I've got one with me here today. So I could just. It's all right. It was already broken. I could just suspend the talk and auction this for your favourite arts institution, but I've got one if anybody would really like to see it. Having done this decade of work, I can tell you that family foundation giving has been growing steadily in the UK over the last decade. And there are many, many new donors coming in, people who are giving their money away during their lifetimes. Overall, the giving by family-funded foundations has grown at about 4% per annum, which in a period of recession is pretty good. What we discovered in a recent bit of work was that 75% of our family foundations have got living family trustees on the board, and many of them are today's founders and donors. Now, what this shows you is a very high engagement of families in their giving. Foundations are used for most major giving, not all of it. So foundations are just a way of talking about major giving. They're not particularly specialised. They're a tax-efficient way of doing your major giving. So there is this high level of involvement of families. And the reason I've highlighted this is because we also looked at what family foundations were giving to. And there you can see how high arts and culture is on the giving agenda of family foundations. It represents 18% of giving if you take health out of the frame, which we have to do in the UK because of the Wellcome Trust, which is a giant that skews all the data. So if I take the Wellcome Trust out, you can see that arts and culture attracts nearly a fifth of all the major family giving. And I found that this was even higher than it is in the US, where it ranged from about 6 to 13% across the different regions. So really what I want to draw attention to here is that through family foundations, many younger donors coming into, or not younger, but new donors coming into giving are supporting arts and culture and making quite big gifts. And in the US, there's quite a similar picture. There's been a huge growth of family foundations. They very often give to their local patches, as my family foundations do. They give to cultural institutions in their local area. They're often opting for limited lifespan, so they don't want the foundations to last in perpetuity. They want to get involved in giving their money away themselves. They don't want other people to be giving their money away, so they don't want professional management of foundations other than that which they influence. 70% of the US foundations were created after 1990, which shows you what a live picture it is. And 66% in the US have got younger generations on the board. Now, I would guess it's similar in the UK, but I haven't got data for that. And 2/3 in the US have the founding donors actively involved. So when we're talking about philanthropy in the arts and in other fields, we're talking about living donors. We're not talking about some abstract thing. So the challenge is, how do people get involved in giving to arts foundations, whether through their foundations or major giving? Next slide. So I wanted to try to get a bit of a handle on this, this what giving to arts and culture actually looks like. And several people have made the point that there's very little data in the field. But I did get access to a database of actual gifts. And it wasn't a perfect database, but I've done a bit of analysis of giving by individuals and giving by trusts, looking at actual gifts. So what you're looking at here are analysis of actual gifts made to arts and culture organizations in 2015. And I don't know of any other data like this. I think it's unique. What I wanted to, what I thought, the chart on the left, which is the black bars, that's analysis of 4,000 individual gifts ranging from £25 on the left-hand side to over 200, is it over 20,000 on the right-hand side, is that you can see, which is, I think, quite unusual, a bunching of quite big gifts in the middle. So there are at £500 to £1,000, and 1,000 to 1.5, and 1.5 to 3,000, there are a lot of gifts. And I thought this was quite an atypical picture. In fact, I found that whereas median annual giving, according to our UK giving surveys, is about £168, when I analysed this database of gifts to the arts and culture, median giving was much, much higher at £675. So this confirms my picture of arts and philanthropy giving as specialised, as being of high level, and involving committed donors. Well, we know this, but this gives you data that backs it up. And if you look at the trust and foundation donations, you can see in some ways a very similar picture, that the green and the purple and the turquoise bars around about the middle represent, well, there's a lot of trust donors represent gifts ranging from 10k to 200k. So there's a lot of big foundation gifts. That picture is characterized by a sort of bunching in the middle. So I think this helps us to understand what kinds of donors we're talking about, and who we have to look for when we're thinking of expanding the constituency of people who give to arts and philanthropy. This gives a sort of, this picture helps to back up the kind of ways we might think about it and who we're targeting. The individual donations, by the way, were spread across 11 cities to 27 different institutions, so quite a wide spread. And we're not just looking at, the London factor there. Next slide. So the next chart, this with the orange bars, is a breakdown of that trust giving only. A number of the gifts and grants made by the foundations had another classification added to them. So they were arts and culture, and then it told you a bit more about which bit of arts and culture they were for. And you can see, and this is absolutely classic for the UK, and I can't speak for other countries, but heritage, anything to do with history and the heritage, terribly important, attracts a lot of grants. But you can also see that some of those grants for arts and culture were for education and training, they were for children and youth, they were for welfare, they were for health, they were for disability. So this is where we see this kind of instrumentalism coming in terms of trust and foundation funding for arts and philanthropy. Trusts and foundations are often looking for how arts and culture grants benefit particular needs groups. Now that is a bit of a problem for arts and culture philanthropy, and we've been talking about this because it should not be the only justification for funding arts and culture. And we've been talking a lot about how we develop our own narrative to to explain why giving to arts and culture is important. And it's not just because we're inclusive in terms of bringing in people with disabilities or because there are health benefits from certain kinds of involvement. And so that challenges the narrative. And in the UK, it's particularly difficult because arts and culture per se are not a charitable objective, so you can't get tax reliefs unless you can link it to an instrumental objective, and that's another challenge for giving to arts and culture. And one of the problem, in a sense, I think, has been exacerbated because of Brexit. Because one of the impacts of Brexit has been to make people think much more about who has been marginalised and have they done enough about social justice. So the whole social justice agenda related to arts and culture is moving up, and trusts and foundations will be looking even more now for instrumental reasons for justifying why you would give to arts and culture. And I think that's a narrative that in many ways we need to counter with a much stronger one about why arts and culture is very important. And Brexit itself is one reason why we're going to need even more arts, cross-cultural understanding than we have had. Next slide, please. So this is just an example of one of our major donor couples. And I picked out David Harding for a number of reasons. One is because when he described his gift, he described exactly how this 5 million gift to the Science Museum in London engaged different aspects of his life. It was important to him because he was wealthy, and he moves in a group of wealthy people. It reflected his passions in life and what he'd studied. It reflected his professional interests because he's looking at the history of monetary history, and he is a hedge fund manager. And it was also about his local connections because it was a gift to Oxford. So it linked him into, it's a way of engaging much more with his own local community, which just happened to be Oxford and Oxford University, which also linked him with his professional and business interests. So I think engagement is a hugely important way of thinking about these major arts and culture gifts. And I also picked him because he was a major donor to the UK's Remain campaign. Right, a few words. Am I okay on time? Yeah? Yeah? Right, so I wanted to highlight that work I'd done on the foundations and on the kinds of things I've been finding out about gifts to arts and culture. And I want to talk now about the work that I've done on the younger millennium generation donors. Now, this was a piece of research that was sparked off by the City Bridge Trust, which is the Corporation of London's charity, who were interested in finding out how they could engage more young city workers and professionals to get involved in philanthropy. We defined the millennium generation as people born around about 1980 and entering the labour market at the millennium. Now there's contested theories about this generation. On the one hand, that they are much more socially, environmentally concerned because they've begun to see some of the systemic faults in capitalism. The other is that because the environment has become so much harsher than the kind of heady days of the 80s when the city really took off, they're actually more individualistic and hard-headed and ambitious. So those are the kind of contested views of this generation. And employers have been studying them, as well as those who look at the consumer markets and so on. So there's been a lot of interest in them. I had two samples for this research. One was a sample of young employees across London, just generally in any job. And the second sample, which was to look at giving in greater depth, was members of young donor networks which have been cropping up in London. We sent questionnaires to members of 21 networks that are young professional donors networks. They do tend to be professional people. They're very loose networks. They have different kinds of agendas. Some fundraise, some don't. They share ideas. They share their experience of being involved in philanthropy. They're very keen to link up their work lives and their philanthropic lives. And some of the networks are actually created within companies and have company mentors. So the companies are actually making a link between managerial development and philanthropic development, which is very interesting indeed. And there has been talk of actually building in a sort of philanthropic engagement indicator into performance measurement within companies in the city. So I had these two samples, the general sample and this very dedicated group of people in the networks. Can I have the next slide? So having looked a little bit at the foundations, and this question is, do generations differ in their attitudes towards giving? And across the whole of those two reports on the two studies, I found enormous differences between the under 35s and the older age groups. With the under 35s, 35% of them said they wanted to give more, 50% of them said they wanted to get more involved. Now, what you have to ask yourself is, what's stopping them? Do they have the opportunities? And clearly they don't. Although we think we do an awful lot, but clearly they're not getting engaged and they aren't finding the routes to engagement. I found that in every way, the younger generation were more oriented towards companies having strongly social and environmental policies within their business objectives, and generally more keen to translate their values into all aspects of their lives in an integrated way. So we asked a number of questions, and this is just to illustrate the difference in the two generational attitudes. Because one question was, what would encourage you to do more giving? And as you can see on the left, which is the under 35s, what came out quite high was more information about the impact of my donations. Am I doing any good? And on the left-hand side, you can see that the strongest response was, nothing would encourage me to give more money to charities and community groups. So, I don't think what we're seeing here is a load of mean, grumpy old people who don't want to give anymore. And I think it's that they've settled into their patterns. What it's telling you is that the really fertile territory is the under 35s. Can I have the next slide, please? And in terms of the networks, what we found looking at these young donor networks was that they claimed that the experience of being in these networks had brought them knowledge, an enhancement of their leadership skills, a greater ability to empathize. Many thought that in return they were bringing added business value to the organizations they helped. We found that once people were in networks, they were highly tax-effective donors. They volunteered at a high level, for example, as trustees. A lot of them were giving through pooled giving initiatives, and 10% of them had already set up their own private foundations and trusts, and were making their own, or were making donations through their companies. So the research suggested that work-based and other young donor networks are a powerful way of motivating and reinforcing philanthropic interests among young workers. And if encouraged, particularly in the workplace, they could be mobilized to get much more involved. But the quid pro quo is that they want to be much more engaged in the causes they give to. They want to help manage them and run them and measure their impacts, and that's a very big challenge, of course, for charities. You may see that as a bit of a gift horse. So last slide, I'll just I'll go back to the other one. Yeah. I was very interested in where is all this giving coming from, and asked about who were the key influencers on people in the networks and across the sample generally. And what you can see there is that 67% of people in networks said their friends and their acquaintances were key influencers on their giving, and that was only 32% amongst the general population. And then family members also showed the same difference. So once people who are in networks are people who have been influenced by others who are involved in giving. It's their friends, it's the people they're engaged with who are encouraging them. And I think we have to look at these roots too, and not think of donors as isolated individuals, but where are the forums in which they're engaged, and how does philanthropy fit into all of that? I mean, one of the disappointing findings from the city's point of view was the last one, because they asked us to ask how important were managers and other corporate leaders in terms of being role models, and they came out very, very low indeed. They wanted to think they were all very key role models, but they're not. The key role models are the people that the young people engage with. So I'll leave it at that.
Cathy, thank you so much.